Hello everyone, this is Arvind Virmani. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the budget 2021-22 with a title as Reforms for Inclusive Growth. It's the first post-pandemic budget and I focus on certain issues and suggestions which are partly new and most urgent. The first one is the declining trend in GDP growth, which has been seen for the past 2 years and has been worsened by the pandemic. In my view, this requires policy reforms for accelerating inclusive growth. The second issue which I take up is the rise in unemployment due to contagion fears, particularly in what I call mass contact services. For this, we need targeted government expenditures and incentives, which I will comment on. Third weakness that has come up during the pandemic is in poverty alleviation or anti-poverty programs and in public health related issues, which were central during the pandemic. For this, I suggest integration and reform of the welfare system and refocus of government health systems which exist already in states from primary health to secondary health, and refocus them on better providing public health and public health education and R&D. The first issue, inclusive growth policy. As we all know, SMEs and household enterprises employ roughly 80% of the labor force. There is also a key role of startups and modern SMEs in employment generation and export growth. The critical problem for SMEs is compliance costs, financial cost and time are too high. We need to simplify and rationalize the indirect tax system. Here I should mention the focus on SMEs with respect to compliance costs. There are of course general compliance costs that affect everybody, but the corporate tax reforms which occurred in September 2019 has simplified the tax system, the direct tax system considerably for corporations. So we need to do the same for SMEs and households. This will help efficient import substitution and export of labor intensive goods, particularly man-made artificial mixed fibers, fabrics and garments, which have performed abysmally in India. There are also some other reforms which are needed. One is on Apprenticeship Act to promote skilling. It become the skills needed, because learning by doing is a key aspect of skilling for manufacturing, and manufacturing is going to be intimately connected with many things which we will talk about, and the ease of regulatory compliance where is a broader issue which affects everybody. I just mentioned them here for the record. I won't go into details in this talk. Tax reforms, direct tax code and GST. Direct tax code, we have a 20th century DTC with layers of sections, provisos added over 60 years. It was 60 years ago that this thing was built, and then instead of reforming it, we keep adding sections, subsections, provisos to it to meet modern requirements. We cannot create a 21st century Atmanirbhar startup and SME system. What we need is a 21st century direct tax code which is up to global best practices. Now there are already several committee reports, task force reports which can be dug out to do these reforms. If we do the reform, the tax buoyancy will rise with ease of paying taxes for SMEs and households. Now, there is also a subsidiary issue of surcharges, which are 12% on top of the marginal rate of 30%, can be as high as 12%. Now, these can be phased out gradually if the government is unwilling to get rid of this in one go, which in my personal view would be optimal, and take the hit in FY22. But if government is reluctant to do that, these can be phased out as the buoyancy increases and government is confident that the reforms will produce more revenue than would have occurred otherwise. The goods and services tax. The most important reform and simplification that can be done in this is to make 75% of goods have a uniform 15% rate. We have often talked about a single uniform rate, but about 75% of the goods, if you do, there will be a massive simplification and incentive for SMEs. And of course, there must be no cess on it, because if you add cesses on top of this 15% tax rate, you can multiple rates. You can get 10 different rates with 10 different cesses. So again, besides the main purpose, it will also facilitate exports of labor-intensive goods, for example, by easing refund of GST, making it very quick and effective. It will also make it easier for the tax authorities themselves to monitor leakages and catch evasion. And it will, like the direct tax reform, it will also raise the revenue buoyancy. So given that taxes would rise in future above what they would have been, one could even give some, one could do a revenue neutral reform as far as current calculation. The third element of the indirect tax reform, the total tax reform, is tariff reform and trade policy. Now, Atmanirbhar Bharat and inclusive growth requires external reform to complement the ongoing domestic reforms. I have counted roughly 7 or 8 major reforms from September 2019 when the corporate income tax reforms were instituted. But we also need to do external reforms. And what I suggest is something called a dualistic trade policy with 3 goals, which may appear contradictory at first, but can actually be carefully designed, as I show you how. So goal 1 is to reduce dependence on monopolized exports. Certain countries, one in particular, have monopolized the export of many products which India buys and which the world buys. And it is critical to diversify out of this single monopoly dependence for economic, social and national security reasons. And the best way to do this is to build minimum efficient scale. One of the ways in which we suffer in comparison to several of our competitors, and particularly China, is that the scale of their production is much higher and much more efficient. Now, it's not always that we need to match the scales that they have, but there is a minimum efficient scale in many industries, and we must be at that minimum efficient scale. Once we are at that minimum efficient scale, you can compete with even firms which are double or triple that scale. The advantage just comes in this minimum efficient scale. So the investment subsidy, the product linked incentive scheme, is a very good scheme designed for this purpose. But what we need to do is to coordinate this product linked incentive with selective phased temporary higher tariffs. So there has been a tendency in the previous 2 years to raise tariffs without carefully considering how they match with the generation of productive capacity which would be competitive. So it's okay to do selective phased temporary higher tariffs, but on labor intensive consumer goods monopolized by China and inputs into which PLI has created minimum efficient scale. Because if you put higher tariffs on inputs, which are used by other industries before creating this efficient capacity, then the the industries which are using these inputs suffer. So there is no net gain. So you may promote the production of inputs, but the users will suffer. So the coordination is very necessary between the PLI scheme to create minimum efficient scale and the temporary tariffs to allow time for people to recognize and shift over to domestic tariff policy. The second goal is to promote employment generating exports. India is missing from global supply chains, and we are in basically niche products. Now 70% of international trade is within supply chains. Given that we are missing for this supply chain, our export proportion of world exports is less than 2%. It's minuscule compared to many Southeast Asian countries and of course China. So this is because 70% of international trade is within supply chains. USA and EU are drivers of GDP growth and export demand. So the supply chains ending in USA and EU are critical to growth. 50% of trade further, if you look within this 70%, 50% of trade is intra-MNC, within multinational corporation. So FDI from these MNCs and their suppliers plays a critical role for entering these supply chains. Most MNCs are headquarters in USA, EU, UK and Japan, and therefore FTAs with USA, EU and perhaps UK are critical for attracting these supply chains, which also help you grow your exports. There is this misunderstanding that somehow China and Southeast Asia and RCEP are critical. It is just not true, because they are all part of supply chains which end in USA, EU, UK and Japan. So it's more important to get into FTAs with countries which are the final destination of the supply chains, which also host these MNCs through which these supply chains operate, etc. And of course, there is a supply chain resiliency initiative started by Japan, which Australia has joined. We must make efforts to get USA, EU, UK to join these supply chain resiliency initiatives, which will help us in diversification into these supply chains. The main way to do this simplification is simplify the imports tariff structure to reduce its variability. The more variability there is in tariffs across products, within product chains, etc., the more difficult it is to get into the supply chain. So a uniform tariff, so for example, I mentioned textiles earlier. There are 15 specific rates on textiles. It's amazing that in this day and age, few countries have specific rates. We have. So these should be combined to a single rate. This will have a huge benefit for textile exports, particularly of man-made fibers, mixed fibers, etc. Then we also, if you reduce the variability and make it completely uniform, for example, this provides equal effective protection to all products, all inputs, all intermediates, so that there is more efficient export. And so uniformity is a desirable goal for this purpose, uniform effective protection. Lower tax rate, we have raised rates by about 1.3% points. The latest World Bank IMF calculations show that over the last 5 years, the average rate of tariffs has increased by about 1.3% points. I think we should lower it, except for achieving goal 1, which I have already outlined earlier. But so leaving aside those particular commodities where we are trying to import substitute away from products monopolized by China, we should lower the rates in general. This will facilitate supply chains which use a lot of imports for exports. The whole point of a supply chain is that at different stages of production, they import export. So in the chain for one good, for example, a radio, there'll be many stages, and an efficient producer, if you want to be part of the supply chain, you'll be importing something, exporting the product from that, again importing something at a later stage, and so on. So you can enter at many different labor intensive stages of a supply chain for each product. Agriculture trade. The third goal of this trade, tariff and trade reform, is to diversify agricultural and allied sectors. This is very important, as we know from many historically. 50% of the population is directly or indirectly dependent on trade. 73% of population still lives in rural areas, and even the indirect trade, the services and non-agricultural products for these people are linked there. So this is a very important goal of trade policy. The exempt policy reform must complement the domestic reforms. Domestic reforms have started, they are very important. There may need to be minor corrections to what has policy reform which has been done, but the exempt policy also needs to be reformed to complement domestic reforms. And the key point here is that historically, and to this date, though there may not have been recent instances of this, ad hoc changes are made in QRs, quantitative restrictions, import tariffs and export duties, whenever there are weather fluctuations or price fluctuations. But these seldom benefit the farmer or the poor consumer in the name of which these actions are done, because there's always big lags between the actual change, the change in price, and the policy action on the external front. And this hugely increases the risk of investment in new agricultural supply chain, in new exportable products, in new markets. So what we need to do is replace this current system by an import tariff export duty ban for each major product which has seen these the arbitrary QR changes. And within this band, prices should be allowed to fluctuate freely. Outside these bands, this import tariff and export duties will automatically come into operation. This system I suggested in my last year as CA, other people have subsequently suggested it. It is not very difficult to design, and this will protect both consumers and producers from excessive price fluctuation. You know, every price fluctuates. They must be able to manage the normal price fluctuation, but it will help them from the extreme price fluctuation. Farmers when the prices go down too much, consumers when they go up too much. And it will provide a much more stable framework for diversification of agriculture and allied industries. The second issue which I raised at the beginning was pandemic-related unemployment. Now, just a few facts of this before I tell you what suggestions I have for this problem. Unemployment rate normalized very quickly. And what do I mean by normalization? By July, August, the unemployment rate, as shown by private surveys, which are regular private monthly surveys, was equal to what it had been in July, August of 2019. So this was very puzzling. So, but the thing was that labor force participation had simultaneously fallen by 2%. What this means in economic analysis is that because of fears of getting COVID, contagion fears, certain proportion of the workforce stopped looking for a job. They withdrew from the labor force. About 2% of such people withdrew from the labor force because of fears of contagion. Now, what has happened is that in December, 3/4 of these, about 1.4%, have come back into the labor force and are looking for jobs as fears of contagion reduce. But what this means is that unemployment rate has jumped, and it is now in December is roughly 20% higher than it was in December of 2019. So what needs to be done? In my analysis suggests this is mostly due to the indoor contact services and goods used by these contact services. Now, what are these contact services? To give you a few examples, malls, theaters, parties, marriage parties in indoor, these are all services which are provided, not all of them, but many of them, restaurants, hotels, are provided indoors where there is a higher danger of transmission of the COVID virus, the coronavirus. These are right. I mean, people are scared, and rightly scared that they will get the COVID if they participate in these. So these have not recovered, and they are unlikely to recover for another 6 months or so till the corona vaccine results in a sharp reduction in active cases. So the slow recovery is likely, and the government should, what the government should do is to incentivize, accelerate, is twofold. One is to generate more employment outside this sector by accelerating infrastructure and public goods projects which are construction intensive. These are known to generate more employment more quickly. Plus, this will also stimulate consumption demand, because many of these are unskilled people and poor people. So they are more likely to spend whatever they receive. And the second element is directly related to the contact services, that is to incentivize through fiscal incentives the installation of virus cleansing filter systems, in indoor contact services. So this will reduce the risk of contagion in these closed spaces. If people install these virus quality filters, UV filters, etc., which have been shown to be effective, and it will also reduce the fears and allow people to go and use these services with less risk of contagion. Obviously till the vaccines also take effect, but that's not going to happen for another 6 months or so. So this is very important if we want to bring this sectors of the economy to normalization. The third problem which I mentioned at the beginning, is the welfare issues and the reforms needed. Now, systemic problems of poverty alleviation include missing poor. That is, there are hundreds of programs by the center and states, but they still miss, amazingly, they miss certain poor. Every once in a while we hear of somebody dying of hunger who wasn't receiving anything, somebody in remote areas, etc., rural areas, etc. And this is unacceptable. In this digital world, we have the capability. Crisis transfers, whether it's pandemic, hurricane or floods, they are people who suddenly and for a short time need help. We've all been read about the migrants, for example. So, if it's a tsunami or a flood, these things will happen every once in a while. And we must have a system which is able to reach those who are affected. There's no point in saying give everybody 1,000 rupees. We cannot afford that. We can afford to build a system which addresses this issue. The third problem, again, which is long term and not just in crisis, is maldistribution of transfers and subsidy. That is, people get more transfers from central and state governments than they deserve or they're entitled to, while others get less than they should. And of course, multiple central and state programs. I mentioned, last time I studied it, there were 250 different central and state programs at the district level, all designed to help the poor, to help development, etc. So leakages and corruption is again a well-known problem which needs to be addressed. Now, I propose a system which consists of three pillars: a welfare stack. You can on what we have learned from the health stack, the fin stack, UPI, etc., can be used for this. A welfare card and a DBTM system. Let us quickly, one by one, go over what these mean. The welfare stack will be a digital stack which contains all central and state entitlements. So it will be one place where all these entitlements are known and put up, any researcher who is allowed or can go to this, but the point is it cover all the programs. The second component or pillar is what I call a virtual integrated welfare smart card, VISC for short. And this will cover all, this should include, it should be inclusive to cover all hungry, absolute poor and vulnerable people. So there will be a deliberate effort to identify and include all these people into the VISC. And of course, for convenience, where and what is the meaning of virtual? Virtual is it will be on the stack. So people, anybody, with a given their Aadhaar number, they will be able to access this virtual card and see their own virtual card and be able to see that what are the central and state entitlements that they are eligible for. So it will link all the central and state entitlements with all the poor, absolute poor and vulnerable, and therefore empower them. And the third pillar of this new welfare system will be what I call will be a kind of direct cash transfer system, which can be called DBT mobile, which will have all the central government poverty alleviation programs and subsidies. So all these will be funds going to all these will be pooled to cover the lower 40% of the population, and plus I would say another 5% or so which periodic shocks affect their income and they fall below this 40% and they come out of it, who go in and out of this 40%. Now I call it DBTM for short because it will emphasize and use the mobile, the JAM, M in mobile for delivery to empower especially two categories of people. One, of course, is migrant labor and self-employed migrants who are geo-divided families. So the migrant labor or migrant self-employed is gone from rural areas, left his family and is working in an urban area. So they are geo-divided. So it's very important to empower these migrants because they may be on the move. We saw during the pandemic they were moving from one place to another. So if they are empowered through the mobile, if they can receive payments, direct cash transfers into their mobile wallet, then this will be a big empowerment of these. And the second category is rural women for many reasons, whether economic reasons, social reasons, or other reasons. Many rural women are restricted in their mobility. So if the cash machine is miles away from their village, it's very difficult for them to access it. So we could even give them free mobiles so that they are empowered. This will have a huge effect on empowering. They can receive money in their hand, and we will ensure that divided families, of migrants, for example, the migrant received his share, and the women and the children in the family who may be in the rural areas receive whatever is due to they are entitled to. I would also recommend merging PMKY into this DCT DBTM system by pooling the fertilizer subsidy. But this is a call the government can take. The timing and phasing is not essential that it be done all at the same time. And this new system will have the additional benefit besides better delivery, targeting, and ensuring all the other things I mentioned. It will have the additional benefit of a demand stimulus. Because the money will be transferred from transfer of income to higher MPC poor, poor who have higher marginal propensity to consume, than from those who are benefiting or siphoning off the leakages, the black money savers. They have a lower MPC. Now, in some future date, I would also recommend linking it to the NIT system, which we have proposed along with others, net income transfer or a negative income tax system, but that is for the future. Third, the public health system. early research showed that coronavirus concentrations in sewers was very high. Subsequent research has also shown that public bathrooms are also very heavy transmitters of the COVID virus. The danger of contacting coronavirus is higher in public bathrooms because of obvious reasons. So what we need to do is think into the future and modernize our sewage systems. In many small towns, many cities, the large cities also, the sewage systems are straining. In many urban areas, even Delhi, the sewage which goes out is not properly processed. It's dumped into the rivers. It pollutes the water. That will carry, viruses all over the country. So we need to modernize the sewage systems to minimize the risk of future epidemics and to control environmental entropy. Now, this is a very important point because research has shown, in fact, I call it research has implicated that this environmental entropy is implicated in stunting. Stunting has been in the news recently, but few people know that there is a disease called entropy, which is contacted through the environment, like slums which have sewage flowing in the streets or surrounding houses. That kind of environment can give rise to enteropathy, which makes it impossible for a person, whether even if they get good food and nutrition, to absorb this nutrition. And this has been shown in this research to be a cause of stunting. So this would have a great another benefit, if you want to call it a collateral benefit, of modernizing the sewage systems. So for this purpose, one could start a new mission, but I think it fits into the overall objectives of the Swachh Bharat mission, and that could be broadened. The second element of this is of my suggestion is that public health system. There are government systems in operation from the 60s, primary health, secondary health, but these need to be reoriented. The most important role is in public health. So focus on and get expertise in dealing with contagious diseases, spread of diseases, monitoring, control systems, etc. Secondly, again, the pandemic has shown that health education is very important. We had to start from scratch by educating people on hand washing, on distancing, etc. But schools should teach students about viruses, bacteria, etc., contagious diseases, non-contagious. They should know the difference and the value of cleanliness, of better nutrition. As part of this COVID, we have been told that vitamin D and certain other vitamins reduce the chance of getting COVID. So health nutrition generally, I think, is very important to focus on health education in schools and media. And finally, of course, R&D now, which is also being talked about, but often loses focus, is on these contagious vector-borne diseases and vaccines. So these are the main items. I mentioned, by the way, the importance of reforming the Apprenticeship Act to make it easy to train trainees in large corporations, because these large corporations are the best set up. They have the managerial capacity to train people, and if the Apprenticeship Act is modified to make this easy for them, then they will train much larger number of people. Out of these, let's say they train 10 people, they generally give permanent employment to 1 or 2. Those 8 others are available to MSMEs and startups, etc. So it is much more important. It's again connected to what I said about MSMEs. And secondly, this proposals have been made on digitization of the all regulations. So there are a number of actions which can be taken on that. So given these things, so what will be their effect? So let's start with what is expected for the current year. From the beginning of the year, we have said that growth rate for FY21 would be -5% plus minus 2.5% because of the huge uncertainties in the pandemic. And then in May, June, we said that there was a downward bias in this. So what does that mean? Now, given that the advanced estimates have said -7.7, that is close to our range, but we are sticking with our own forecast, which amounts to -7.5% to -5% for the year. So we are confident that the growth rate will still inch up above -7.5%, better than that. What about next year? Next year we expect a major rebound. We were first on the record to say it will be double-digit growth. What does that mean precisely? The precise forecast is 10% minus plus 1%. So the range uncertainty has gone down from 2.5% to 1%, but it still remains higher than normal. The normal uncertainty range I generally give is plus minus 0.5. So this means that growth could be between 9% and 11% for the next financial year. Post implementations of reform agenda. As I have mentioned before, there are a number of steps which the government which government has been doing since September 2019. More are in process. For example, a few days ago, there was a mention of cabinet approving mining sector reforms. But if all these reforms in process are undertaken, and the ones I have suggested above are done in 2021, then we can expect a growth rate of between 7 and 8%. That is 7.5% plus minus 0.5% for the next decade. Now, this is not as easy as it sounds, because the global GDP, global demand environment is much worse than the last time we attained 7.9% growth or so for a couple of years. So it will be a hard slog, but I think the reforms which I have mentioned will be able to get us to grab the opportunities, to avoid the dangers which are there, which are present in the global environment, and help us grow above 7%. But it's not a situation where one can just go to sleep after doing all these reforms. To sustain growth over a long period after it accelerates, new bottlenecks arise. This is not an automatic pilot kind of approach. Growth is not automatic. So as new bottlenecks arise, these will be addressed. But given all these reforms, I am confident that the government will be able to take care of these problems. Thank you.